Wind and Tide.
Just before we begin today's episode, we want to ask you, our listeners, for some input. This January, we head into our second year and season of Family 360, and we would love to gather some feedback.
Yeah, we'd love to know what you'd like to hear more of, what episodes you've enjoyed, what topics or questions you'd like us to explore.
All of the above. We'd also love to know how the production of the episodes resonate with you. We're finding our interviews increasingly flowing into 2 episodes.
Does that work for you?
And anything else you choose to share.
We would really value your input. And when you leave us a comment, you'll be linked to a beautiful solo Christmas album to stream on the music service of your choice. Created by Roy for those quiet evenings when your kids are in bed and you just want to exhale. Our gift to you. This album is honestly a #1 favorite in my family. You will love it.
Thanks for that, Rachel.
It's true. It's an amazing album.
So pop onto our website,
family360podcast.com.
Yes, just go to the question tab and you'll find lots of space for comments and questions.
And now, let's get started. Hello and welcome to Family 360,
a podcast of conversations exploring life together,
parenting, and all the ways we are family to each other. I'm Rachel Cram, educator and founding director of Wind and Tide Education Community.
I'm Roy Salmon, audio producer and founder of Whitewater Studios. And together, we're the hosts
of Family 360, interviewing specialists,
artists,
and storytellers.
And now for this week's episode.
This week, we're with best-selling author Ann Douglas, whose book series, The Mother of All, created the launch for what is now over 30 beloved literary guides for navigating the complicated waters of family life.
Many of Ann's books grew from the processing of challenges in her own family life. Her most recent books share from her childhood when her mother struggled with hallucinations of bipolar disorder.
And how that legacy of mental health continues with her own mental health challenges and with her now adult children.
In addition to her acclaimed writing, Ann is also the weekend parenting columnist for CBC Radio, offering parents resources, support, and hope.
She's a wise and very caring woman.
She is. So let's jump into the first of a 2-part conversation with author and parenting specialist, Ann Douglas.
Okay. Well, do you feel ready to go?
Definitely.
Okay. Well, today we're with author and parenting specialist Ann Douglas. And where I'd love to start is even just looking at the reasons why you write books, because you have, 30 books now?
About that, it's funny because I have editions in Canada and the US and internationally. And sometimes I've done multiple editions of the same book. I can't keep track because I don't know. Like this book, I may have literally written 6 times.
Oh.
So yeah.
You're a hardworking woman.
I am.
Well, and for the sake of this interview, I want to focus mainly on your last 2 books, Parenting Through the Storm, which focuses on mental health, navigating that bumpy road as parents and as a family, and your newest book, Happy Parents, Happy Kids, an invitation and endorsement of our self-care as parents. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's totally fine.
So you're a wise and persuasive advocate for the importance of self-care for parents. And I realize that's informed by both your extensive research as well as your own personal experience. So to begin, I really want to pick up on this one line that you have from Parenting Through the Storm where you say, I hope I can help you to avoid spiraling downward to the same extent that I did when my children were struggling. I ended up nosediving into a 3-year-long depression and gaining 100 pounds. So if I seem to preach self-care a little too enthusiastically in this book, it's for good reason. I'm a pretty passionate convert. So, and with all your writing, you definitely always reflect your desire to support others through your extensive research, of course, but also through your own personal experience and discovery.
It's funny because, when you've been writing books for a while, people will approach you with all kinds of different topics. And in order to put the energy and passion that goes into literally spending years researching and writing and promoting a book, I have to care passionately about that subject. And often what has drawn me to writing about a particular topic has been a deeply personal experience. I'm thinking back to one of my earlier books, which I'll just touch upon briefly. It was called Trying Again, and it was a guide to pregnancy after miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. And it was the experience of going through stillbirth myself that made me realize I want to talk to other people, other families who've been through this, and how they came through the other side of that experience. And parenting through the storm is in that same category, having gone through the mill with my 4 kids over a very long and wearying 6 to 10 years. And as you alluded, me getting completely physically and emotionally depleted. Oh, it would have been so much easier if I'd known about self-compassion. So that's really why I wanted to write this book. I wanted to give people a message of hope that, yes, things are really hard right now, and yes, they can get a lot better. And also, you can take care of yourself in the meantime.
Well, often as you're leading into having children, you're thinking about the baby room, the nursery, the wallpaper, the ivory snow detergent that you're going to use.
That lovely smell.
Yeah. And that's wonderful to think about. And there's really no way of preparing yourself for what the reality is.
Yeah.
And not just on your own sense of identity, but also your relationship with your partner.
Yeah. I think the intensity of the emotional experience of being a parent and how suddenly you're reallocating some serious amounts of emotional energy in a different direction. And when children are very young, like if you just brought home a baby, that little human needs a huge amount of attention just to survive. Like that's a fact of life. So you can't avoid doing that. But I think that what you want to think over the longer term is how can I maintain the sense of connection? And a lot of the couple's research just boils down to a couple of simple things, like letting that person know that the relationship still really matters to you, having a sense of humor, laughing about the fact that every time you sit on the couch and things start to get a little bit romantic, of course the baby's going to wake up and start crying. It's just like, it's the way it always plays out, and not seeing that as something to be frustrated or angry about, but something
resentful,
just to say that's just the way it is right now, and it won't be that way forever. And looking for little opportunities to invest in the relationship. And when I was a new mom, I used to hate it when people would say something like one size fits all advice, like, it's easy. Just, leave somebody with the baby for
Have a
3
date
hours.
night.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, but what if the baby's breastfeeding every 20 minutes right now? And so I think just figuring out what's going to work for us right now and know that that can evolve over time if you can just maintain that sense of connection and spark. And there will be rough times. I mean, I think that the things I've fought about with Neil the most over our 42 years as a couple, a lot of that is parenting related.
Well, and of course, the intensities of your family life and the power of that potential disconnect is somewhat affected by the realities of who your children are.
Yeah, and the number of them, and the spacing, and the intensity.
And that kind of can even lead into where I'd like to go today of what happens when mental health realities come into your family life.
Yes.
There's a Buddhist tenet that says, life is difficult. And I think often when you're starting into family, you don't want to be reminding people of that. But all these things are realities that make living a beautiful, rich, complex experience.
Yeah.
And but they're not the Hallmark cards of baby announcements. No. From reading your books and listening to your radio shows, Anne, I know your mom, she really struggled with her mental health, and your dad was amazing in his efforts to compensate and support. And yet, as our childhood experience does, this affects how you've moved forth in your own journey as a parent and as an individual.
It does.
Can you talk about that?
Yes. So when I was still a young child, my mom experienced a really debilitating case of postpartum depression. And I think none of us really understood what was going on. I mean,
was that really a known term?
It wasn't even really talked about. Probably it was a clinical thing that doctors knew about, but often people would just trivialize it by saying, oh, it's the baby blues. Everybody's just a little emotional in the days after the birth, which, was totally underestimating the magnitude because my mom had a really hard time. And then around the time I was a young teenager, she started to struggle in a massive way.
From your books, I know she was eventually diagnosed with bipolar disorder, in her case, bipolar 1, which means what?
Which means that you're not just having mood swings, but you're actually having hallucinations or losing touch with reality. It's a really scary thing to witness from the standpoint of the child of that person. My mother is saying stuff that makes no sense. If there's anybody listening to this who's ever been terrified by fake news where somebody's saying something and pretending it's the truth and it's not the truth, how you think, but wait, somebody has to challenge that. Imagine being a young child vulnerable in that situation. And
your mom is putting forth this fake news.
That's exactly what it felt like.
How old were you at that point?
I would have been actually 16, I think.
And those years have their own turmoil?
Oh, totally.
And that on top.
Yeah, because here I am, a teenager with my own built-in mood swings, trying to make sense of who I am in the world. And then the reality is shifting. So that was a really difficult time for our family. And it's funny, I've stayed in touch with my grade 6 teacher, and she said even then, everybody recognized that something was off, but nobody knew what to say or what to do or how to help. And so having that conversation with her a couple of years ago was so validating. It was off enough that other people could notice. It wasn't just me imagining things, because when you're trying to reconstruct memories after the fact, some of it seems really nebulous. And at the same time, you think, how off was it? Off enough that other people noticed.
Well, so often in those situations, you don't know what's normal and what's not normal anymore. It's hard to determine because you're living it all the time.
Exactly.
Now, this is a time in our history where there was limited information on mental health.
Yeah.
Can you bring this story to your own life now? Because as they do for most of us, those mental health concerns from your family of origin carry on into your own adult life and then on into your children's lives. Describe your family's experience, what they've experienced perhaps as a genetic fallout.
For sure. Yeah. I think you take a recipe of family genes, right? You throw in all kinds of interesting characters and traits and you stir and wow. So in my generation, all of my sisters and I have struggled with anxiety, depression. In my case, I've been diagnosed with bipolar 2 disorder. It is a kind of bipolar disorder with the mood swings, but not the accompanying hallucinations.
Mm-hmm. So clearly this could have derailed your life, and yet it hasn't. You're a very successful parenting educator, a very successful author. How have you navigated all of that? You have 4 children, Julie, Scott, Eric, and Ian. How did your family's legacy of mental health affect them?
In all kinds of different ways. And I usually like to talk a little bit about what things were like when they were all struggling and things were at their worst for our family, and then pivot to how much better things got.
Yeah.
Sort of like spoiler alert, things did get a lot better, but let me tell you sort of what we figured out along the way. Yeah, exactly. So starting with Julie. At the time when things were at their worst for our family, she was around 14 going into grade 9, and the wheels really fell off the bus. She was having trouble with a mood disorder. At the time, it was diagnosed as bipolar 2, but it's since been reclassified to be the quiet inattentive kind of ADHD, and that's the diagnosis that she feels is the best fit for her as a young adult. But it took till she was 25 to actually get that figured out. But in the meantime, she was struggling. She was doing all the things she could to manage feelings that were huge and cascading, and she had an eating disorder, and she just was really unhappy. And when things were at their worst, she decided that she had to numb her pain in some way. So while I was out one evening for coffee with a friend, she took 2 handfuls of extra strength Tylenol and came dangerously close to ending her life. In the end, she was fine, but what a terrifying thing to go through as a family. So that's what was going on with Julie. And I should say I had my first 3 kids in rapid succession. They were born at 19-month intervals. So while Julie was having all her struggles, Scott has ADHD, and he's also very, very bright. Both fantastically interesting and exhausting, because he could think of like 10,000 ways to get into trouble in the blink of an eye.
I think I recall you saying that almost on a monthly basis, different ones of your kids were getting suspended from school.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Scott and Eric were kind of a tag team. And Eric not only has ADHD, but he also has a learning disability. I remember at one point he brought some homework home and he showed it to me, and I looked at it and I'm reading this assignment and I realized this is a kid that's in grade 5, grade 6 and doesn't understand capital letters and punctuation. And I remember trying to explain some of these building blocks of language to him, and there was no understanding of it. And I got really scared. I thought, how is he going to get through school? How is he going to function in the world? And because he was struggling so much, he started really acting out at school because he was frustrated, he was anxious, and, sometimes goofing around is a good way to distract the teacher and your classmates if you're having a hard time.
Which was leading to the aforementioned suspensions.
Right.
So all this is going on with your 3 oldest kids, and then you had Ian starting school as well.
Yes. So at the time that these guys were in sort of older public school, Ian was in grade 1. And when I think about grade 1, I always think of it like it's such a magical time. You go to school and you love your teacher and your teacher loves you back. And there was not a lot of love happening around Ian at school. He was suspended 6 times in grade 1 for all kinds of behavioral issues. And it would take another 3 schools before we found a school that could actually cope with him and recognize his many gifts. It also took until he was 10 before we had a diagnosis. And at that point, we found out he had what used to be called Asperger's syndrome, but now is referred to as an autism spectrum disorder. And on top of that, he also has bipolar too, and a learning disability as well. So lots of layers of stuff going on. And
in the midst of that, you had a stillbirth.
Yes.
Your third child
was
was stillborn.
Actually a few years earlier than that. But we were still working through the grief as a family. And once I was brave enough to take the lid off that grief, wow. It was like a cascade.
So, Anne, you painted a picture that I think demonstrates the depth of your experience with mental health. And through your writings and through your interviews and through your work on the radio, I know you to be a very wise and learned woman. And I think that is so important that we recognize these difficulties aren't a result of lack of knowledge, lack of experience, lack of wisdom.
Lack of love.
Lack of love. These are some of the complexities and realities of family life. And as we walk into them, they can seem so chaotic, so overwhelming. And through your books, you give access to a path forward. So I want to jump back into your books. In your book, Parenting Through the Storm, you begin with 3 terms that describe mental health disorders. It seems like there's 3 categories. You say we can struggle with mental health, neurodevelopmental, or behavioral challenges. Do those 3 categories expand to give the full range of what we might experience mental health-wise?
I don't think there's a consensus even in the mental health community on what to put into what bucket. So I figured the best way to handle that was to string all 3 terms together, because some people would see ADHD as being in the mental health category. Others would put it in neurodevelopmental. Others would see it as a behavioral issue. Some might use a couple of those things. So I just wanted to acknowledge this is not narrowly a book about what we think of as mental health. It's much broader. So it's talking about ADHD. It's talking about autism spectrum disorders and all the other things that can temporarily feel like they're causing storm clouds to float over your family while you figure out what it is that you're dealing with. Because I think there's such commonality. When I think of what we went through with Julie with her depression, that's not that different than what we went through with Ian with his Asperger's syndrome. That feeling like, how are we going to figure this out? How are we going to make things better for this kid? And what can we do within our parenting to support this child? And how can we take care of ourselves? So many questions spiral out of that inquiry, right?
Yeah. I think that even having heard you say with Julie that her diagnosis started off as bipolar, but then moved into ADHD. There's such fluidity in our understanding right now, isn't there?
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's part makes it scary as well.
It does. And also, I think it's really important to not get angry if the diagnosis changes over time, because I think some people feel like, oh, the clinicians got it wrong. Not necessarily. It's an information gathering process, and kids are constantly changing. Like, you got a drop of mercury on a cookie sheet and it's moving around and you're trying to describe it. It's changing changing in shape and location constantly. So when you're looking at a 15-year-old who's acting out, is that one part teenagerness and 90% something else? Or what is that? And sometimes you don't know until there's a progression over time. And what I love about Julie is the fact that she was the one in her early 20s who said, I don't think some of these earlier diagnoses were accurate. So she went back to the doctor and had a conversation about what she was noticing in herself. And they made a decision, well, let's do a trial of a medication and see if that helps, because sometimes that's the best way to figure out what actually is going on with a person. And she made the choice to go on the medication, and she said it was life-changing. It was like suddenly she understood how quote unquote normal people could follow a thought through from beginning to conclusion and not have 20 other thoughts doing cartwheels on top of that other thought. She could slow things down, she could organize, she could plan. Being her mother all through this time, I wasn't aware of all that chaos and noise going on in her head.
Well, and how would she even start to describe that to you, right?
Exactly.
When there's no internal baseline for her comparison.
Absolutely.
Plus, during teen years, that kind of conversation is even more complicated sometimes.
Right. And when she was 15, she was at the peak of not liking parental input on things. That's probably a very mild way of saying it. But, really resistant. Like I remember one time we took her for counseling and she wore a T-shirt that said, "My problem is you." That was her message for the counselors. It's like, I'm here, but not a willing participant, So
I'm wondering, where do you start when you begin to realize or wonder if a mental health factor is what you're seeing or experiencing with someone you care about, your child or your partner? Because I think it can feel like a really lonely journey.
It can. And I think a big thing is to trust your knowledge of this person. And if you suddenly see worrisome or marked changes in their day-to-day living, like they don't want to go to bed, or they want to sleep all the time, or they don't want to eat, or they want to eat all the time, or they're really social and they never were before, or vice versa, like the social kid just wants to hang out in their room 24/7, then a little sort of worry bell goes off in your head and you pay attention to that and you check with them to see if they can give you a little bit more information about what's going on. And if you're still not sure, or you're feeling like this could be an emergency situation, you reach out and get a second opinion and start moving the wheels forward. And sometimes parents will say to me, well, what if I do that and I'm wrong, like my child is perfectly healthy? Well, I would much rather be in that situation of having the doctor say, actually we don't think there's cause for concern, than to think, oh, it's probably okay, and then see the symptoms cascade upward, and then suddenly you're in a full-blown crisis.
Go with your gut.
Yeah, if your gut instinct says, I'm worried about this child, then, just make that phone call, set up that appointment.
I think one of the worries that goes through parents' minds is a worry of your child being labeled. What do you say about that?
Yeah, well, you know what? Unfortunately, people are already labeling your kid, and the label they're giving your kid is bad kid. I remember back when Ian was in grade 1, he came home and told me one day he had to have lunch in the staff room with all the other quote unquote bad kids. It's like, you're 6 years old and you're already feeling that you've been labeled bad kid. So I think that in the absence of a diagnosis, sometimes that's where adults will pivot to and where kids will pivot to as well. So a diagnosis doesn't have to be limiting. It's just like the best working theory we have right now of what's going on with your child, which then opens up a world of strategies and supports. Your child may be entitled to extra help in the school system or counseling or any number of other things. So I think that rather than being terrified of that, welcome it as information that you can use, but also don't just leave your child to make sense of this diagnosis on their own. You're there in their court. There's strategies that they can learn to make things better. It won't always be this hard. And if they look around them in the community, there's so many examples of people they know, love, respect, who are dealing with maybe not the exact same issue, but similar struggles, and who are having perfectly great lives. So I think we have to have those kind of conversations and help our kids to see, yes, it's a challenge, But it doesn't have to be a life-limiting challenge, and it doesn't mean you're defective. Because I remember at one point Ian actually saying, I guess I'm your most defective kid. And we had to say, that's not it at all. It's just a case of learning strategies to manage what you're living with, just like I, as the parent with a mental health challenge, have had to learn strategies to manage my moods.
I think beyond, the worry of a label, there's a thought around medication, and,
Yes.
and do we want to do that or not? And the side effects of that.
Yeah, and it's never a conversation or a decision that parents make easily. And I think it's very individual. And sometimes you put a child on a medication and it's not helpful and you reverse that decision. And in other cases, it can be life-changing. And sometimes you don't know until you work through that process. Look at the severity of the impact on the child's life. Is there possibly more to gain than to lose by trying this thing? If the child's being suspended or
if they're thinking they're a bad kid.
Yeah, or having really dark thoughts, maybe it's worth trying this. We had a really great pediatrician, and she would say, don't think about this as forever. This is our strategy for the next 3 months or 6 months, and then we're going to reevaluate that. And she would say that to the kids. And with the boys, she encouraged them to consider whether they wanted to take like a medication vacation over the summer. Do you want to go off your medication all summer long and see how well you can manage without it before school starts again, and then we can reevaluate? And sometimes they said yes, and sometimes they said no. But I just loved the way that she helped them to see that there were always choices. It's not forever, because sometimes I think where people make things harder for themselves is they borrow all a lifetime of worry associated with something, and they think, well, my child be 47 and still having to take this medication. Maybe they won't even need it beyond 13. Who knows? So we take it one day at a time with the best information and make the best decisions we can as parents in that moment. And know sometimes we're going to get it wrong because, spoiler alert, we're human.
Yeah. How complicated is it to find your way to that good pediatrician? It can be a series of steps.
It can be. And so I think start with the family doctor or somebody you have a trusted relationship with and ask them for their best recommendation of who that person might be. Because I think sometimes when you hear stories of ADHD in the news, even now, there's a lot of stigma and judgment and misinformation like, ADHD is just an excuse for bad parenting or being a bad kid. And it's not that at all. So you need somebody who gets that and who will help your child to see that there's actually some wonderful gifts to having an ADHD brain. It's like that random collision of ideas. That's creativity.
Yeah, many of our most creative artists that we know,
Indeed.
that's part of their story.
Yeah.
Just thinking of the loneliness of starting to discover that something's going on with your child. Just as you were talking, I paired it in my mind of, if I buy a white Honda, all of a sudden I'm seeing white Hondas everywhere. But I didn't even know they existed before I owned my own white Honda. And I think that when we start to go down the path of discovery with our child, when we find a pediatrician, but even maybe more so when we start to find the community of people out there who have children that are struggling with their own mental health realities, that's where the loneliness starts to dissipate.
Yes.
And that's where you can gather so much information about what's working for other people, and what's not working. Because the system can be very difficult to navigate on your own.
It can. And I mean, a lot of the parents who are amazing advocates, they do end up becoming like resource clearing hubs for other parents who are following in their footsteps. And it's not just a gift to those other families. It helps to create meaning out of your own experience. Like, yeah, I learned this through the School of Hard Knocks, and let me save you a little bit of hard work. So having friends who are maybe a little further on in the journey is such a gift. And I have my cousin Karen, who also has 2 boys on the autism spectrum. And so she was able to help me figure out, what does this even mean? Where do you find help? What is a legit treatment and what is pseudoscience? And how do I navigate when I'm in panic mode? Step 1, don't be in panic mode. Story of my life. I think I should get a tattoo.
So this is the end of part 1 in our interview with parenting specialist and author Ann Douglas.
Part 2 will pick up right from where we left off with Ann sharing the importance of knowing our default settings for stress.
Yes. And our temptation as parents to blame ourselves when our children struggle.
So here's a bit of what she has to say on that.
it's safer to blame yourself because then you have a cause and effect kind of thing happening, as opposed to my child is struggling and I have no idea why and I have no idea what to do. Your brain does not like uncertainty, so it would rather have you being mean to you than you just wondering what the heck's going on.
So join us for part 2 of our interview with Ann Douglas
On Family 360. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe.
Rate the show, leave a comment, and tell a friend. Each Family 360 episode ends with music inspired by the words of our guest.
You heard bits and pieces of this music during this interview. Here's the song, Calm in the Storm.
And you can find it in our resource section for every episode or wherever you stream music.
I'm Rachel Cram.
I'm Roy Salmond, and thank you so much for listening to Family 360.
To continue these conversations, find us at Family 360 on our website, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
We'd love to journey with you.